Okay, so we are up to the new Perek Kohen Gadol. So let's get started. We're learning Daf Yud Ches today, which is really tomorrow as well. Kohen Gadol, Don, the Kohen Gadol could be a daim, V'Don Oisoi, and he could be the subject of a dintoy. Meid, he could say Edus, Umeidin Oisoi, and you could say Edus on his behalf. Choylitz, he does Chalitza, V'Choylitz Ishtoi, and you do Chalitza to his wife. If he dies without children. You can even do yibum to the almona of a kohen gadol. Aval hu eine miyabim. A kohen gadol is not allowed to do yibum. B'nei shehu aser b'almona, because a kohen gadol is not allowed to marry an almona. Hu isha b'vsula yikach. Right? The pasuk says almona v'rusha v'charo zayna. I say lo yikach. Meis lo deis. What if the kohen gadol had a relative who died? He's not allowed to go to the Levaya. Ella, what they do is,
how does his brother be Miyabim? Brother's also Kohen.
Yeah, but he's not a Kohen Gadol. So a Kohen head is allowed to marry an Almona. The Kohen head is not allowed to marry a Grusha.
Okay, yeah.
The question is, what if his brother's a Kohen head, and after his brother dies, they offer him the position of Kohen Gadol? So then I'm not sure what the halach is over there. I think we had that discussion in Yevamos. Okay, so let's see the Gemara Vayter. So if the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to participate in the Levaya, but he wants to somewhat be there, how do they do it? If the Mita goes through an alley, through a street, and leaves that street, then he can go into the street after the mace left that street. And then they go into one street, he goes to another street. So Rashi explains, it just means that when they go out of one mavli, as Rashi says, now they're covered over from the first mavli because they left it. It's not in their line of sight. There he could go. So basically, he has to stay like one block behind, or one street behind. He can't be part of the Levaya. And the reason for this is because we want to keep him away from becoming Tomei. He has to avoid Tumah, and we don't want that by mistake he should become Tomei. Ad Pesach Sharir. But he's not allowed to leave the Sharir, he's not allowed to leave Yerushalayim, Divrei Meir. The Rambam actually says that a Kohen Gadol must live in Yerushalayim. It's like similar to a prime minister or a president. Wherever they live is not relevant. While they're prime minister, while they're president, they live in the White House. They live in Gracie Mansion, or that's in Manhattan for the mayor. I'm not sure what it's called in Canada, the prime minister's residence. But they have to live in Yerushalayim. One of the reasons given for it is because a Kohen Gadol has to bring a minchas chavitin every single day, and the halach is whenever one brings a carbon, one has to stay over in Yerushalayim that night. That's one of the reasons given for why a Kohen Gadol has to always live in Yerushalayim. Okay, so after more weiter. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eino yotzei min hamikdash. He's not even allowed to leave the base of Mikdash at all to go to the Levaya. Mishum shenemar, because it says in the pasuk, Umin hamikdash lo yotzei. He has to stay in the Mikdash. He's not allowed to leave. When he's menachem, now by a levaya, what we normally do is the people who come to the levaya form two rows, and the avelim walk through the two rows, and everyone says menachem. But in those days, apparently, it was done differently, and the Gemara discusses what the minhag was. But there, it was the opposite: is that the avelim stood in a row and they walked through. So if you look at Rashi, Beshura in the row, when they return from bearing the mace, if you're not a member of the Oval Party, they're so the Oval stayed put, and everybody walked by the Oval, which is the opposite of what we do today. Normally, everyone walks by, and is menachem double, but v'hamamuna mimatzoi inoy leveinaam. His skan, his second in command, as Rashi says, skanakay mimatzoi lekoyin gadol veinoy leveinaam. He puts himself to block the kohen gadol from coming into contact with the am. Shemamuna biyaminoi, the imamuna will be on his right side. V'chol am b'smoiloi u'be'emtza. So he's always kept in the middle, in the center. What if he's the oval and people are coming to be menachem him? Then kala oimrim loi. What is told to him? They tell him onu kaparascha. We're your kapara. Bonu, as Rashi, bonu tiskaper ata. You will be nischaper in us. V'nachnu tachtecha l'chol haroi lovin olecha. Whatever you're supposed to suffer, we're going to shoulder that burden. Okay, Zoti Mishnah weiter. And he responds to them, Tizbarchu min hashamayim, you should be gebashed. Now we know the first meal that a oval eats is brought from others. So that's the Suda Savara. So the halacha is, so people are sitting there with him. He's not, normally the oval sits on the floor and everybody sits around him. But that's not respectful to a kohen gadol. So therefore, everybody sits on the ground. Who mesav al safsel, and he sits on a small bench. So those are the halachas of a kohen gadol. And now the Mishnah transitions to the halachas of a melech. A melech, in contrast, he can't be a dayan, and he's not allowed to be sued in court. They don't pass on him. Loy made. What's that?
Have immunity.
Did you say unity?
I said immunity while they're in office.
Oh, immunity. That's right. It's like a president. They don't. A president is not supposed to go to court because it diverts him from the focus of his job, unless his name is Netanyahu. Then they don't care. Then they push away all norms. They push aside. Okay. So Zok Gemara. He doesn't say edus, and no one will say edus on his behalf. He's not being done. He doesn't do chalitza. And if he dies, you don't do chalitza to his wife.
Man, David HaMelech and Shlomo were donned, and I imagine the Gemara will talk about that.
I guess the Gemara will. I don't know yet. I don't know the Gemara. I'm in suspense together with you.
Well, the famous Shlomo Melech that the two women who came.
I'm not sure what Dan means. If it means the nefashos, if it means the imaminus, and even that was more like a sheilas chacham. That wasn't a din Torah because he didn't have. There were no other dayanim there. So I'm not sure if that qualifies as an official bezdin sitting. We know David HaMelech all day long. He's busy. He was busy with Dam Nida and Dam Leda. So I don't think that's what this means. I think it means the paskin on a formal choshen mishpat trial, or maybe even a misa trial. Mm-hmm. So he does not do chalitza, and they don't do chalitza on his wife. This is going to be a very interesting question. Why doesn't he do chalitza? Why wouldn't the king do chalitza? He doesn't do yibim. And you don't do yibum to his wife. Rashi is going to tell us, not today, in a couple of days, that the reason why a melech does not do yibum, chalitza, is because he doesn't do yibum. He doesn't do chalitza because he doesn't do yibum, which opens up a huge shaila about what is chalitza. Is chalitza just if you want to go free and you want to marry somebody else? So you do chalitza, or is there a mitzvah of chalitza? This was a big tumult in the Achrayim, because it happened many times, where Rechman Litzlan, a woman lost her husband, they didn't have children, but she was not considering to remarry. She was a very old lady, who was 100 years old. So we don't need to do the chalitza to be mater, because she doesn't need to be mater. She's not looking to get remarried. do you need to do chalitza in such a case? There's a big machloikis if you need to do chalitza. Some Sofer says chalitza is a mitzvah to do regardless, and he says that it's a big teos for the nifter, like saying kaddish, so you have to do chalitza anyway. But they bring a little bit of variety from our sugya, where Rashi is going to tell us that the reason why a king doesn't do chalitza is because a king doesn't do yibum. So there are those who bring a variety from here that chalitza is merely a heter, but if you don't need a heter, you don't need to do chalitza.
Also, the difference between a king and a kohen gadol is the Isser chalitza is not on the king. It's not because of the king. It's because of the king's wife. King's wife is not allowed to remarry.
Right, but I'm talking about the king doesn't do yibum either or chalitza. You're talking about doing chalitza on the almana of the king. I'm talking about the king himself doing chalitza.
Uh-huh.
So the Gemara says the reason why he doesn't do chalitza is because he doesn't do yibum. I think Rashi says that. So the question is, why is it totally zevazeh? So there are those who being right that it is totally zevazeh, but that's a very big shaila. The Chacham Tzvi weighed in on it, and some Sofer talked about it. So let's see the Gemara weiter. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Imratzo lachlis oiliyabim zocher latlev." So a king does not have to do yibum or chalitza, but he can if he wants to. Omruloi, they told him back, that's not true. Ain't shoymin. You don't listen to him. You don't let him do yibum or chalitza. That's not his option. And the einois and almanose. No one's allowed to marry the widow of a king. If you do Omer, noise hamelach almanose shel melech. Normally, a regular commoner may not marry the almana of a melech, but a melech is allowed to marry the almana of another melech. Shekein metzidin b'David shenasa almanose shel Shaul. We find by David HaMelech that he did marry the almana of Shaul. Shenemar ve'etna loch es beis adoinecha ves neshei adoinecha b'chekecha. So therefore, you see, you have a right from David HaMelech. Zok tehelu the Gemara. Kohen Gadol, the entire first part of the Mishnah that addresses Kohen Gadol is going to be a little bit troublesome. So let's start with the first halach. Kohen Gadol done. The fact that a Kohen Gadol is allowed to sit on the bezdin, pshita. Why would you say he couldn't? There's no reason why he can't. Zok Gemara, done and I saw it. Really, the whole chiddush is that he could stand as a subject in bezdin, and agav done and I saw it. The Tana said done. But hanami pshita. Why would the Kohen Gadol not go to bezdin? I don't understand. Zok Gemara, Eloi daninalei iu hechidayim. If he wouldn't be subject and he wouldn't be under the jurisdiction of a bezdin, well, then how could it be a dayan? Look, see if the pasuk says his koishu v'koishu. The Amar Shlokish, and Shlokish explained this as meaning shoyt atzmcha v'achakach shoyt acher. Before you give musar to somebody else, make sure that you stick to that, right? You can't shush somebody in shul if 5 minutes earlier you were schmoozing, and punk now you had an inspiration. You're not supposed to give musar to somebody if you yourself aren't there. So similarly, if you're not going to be subject to the jurisdiction of a court, you shouldn't be able to pass on the court. Ella, the reason is I did the kabbalah misning melech. Really, the halachas of Kohen Gadol are not the chiddush of the Mishnah. The focus of the Mishnah is to tell us the halachas of melech, and by melech the Tana tells us loydon v'loydon and Isai, which are chidushim. Therefore, Tana nami Kohen Gadol don v'don. That's why the Tana spoke about the halachas of Kohen Gadol l'gabe paskanim, but it's not for the chiddush of Kohen Gadol; it's for the chiddush of Melech. V'boy say mahakam ashmalon kidetanya. Kohen Gadol shargas and nefesh b'mezid nera. If the Kohen Gadol kills b'mezid, he gets killed just like any other murderer. V'shagig goyla, like any other murderer. And v'over alasei, a Kohen Gadol is over on the say. The Gemara is going to ask, well, why would he be over on the say? What did he do wrong? V'over alasei v'aloisei. He's over the say and aloisei. So the Gemara is going to ask, just because he's a Kohen Gadol, he's automatically over and the say and aloisei. V'arehu kehedit l'chol dvarav. As far as the justice system, he's like anybody else. B'mezid. So Zok Gemara b'mezid ner. Pshita. Why is it a chiddush? Why did the Bryce have to tell us that b'mezid ner? It's partial. Zok Gemara b'shoigeg goyla. It's trichalei. The chiddush of the Bryce is that it goes into golus if he killed b'shoigeg. Frek the Hanami pshita. Why is that a chiddush? Why should he be different than anybody else? Zok Gemara, I'll tell you why. It's true. So kedayta chamina hoyel ksiv. The Yashava, the murderer who murdered B'Shogig, has to sit in the Ari Miklat until when? Ad Mois HaKayin HaGadol, until the Kayin Gadol dies. Ema called the Isle Takanta B'Chazara. Legally, if somebody has the ability that he can go free from the Ari Miklat, if a Kayin Gadol dies, so someone who can have that release, he has to go into Golos. The less like the Kanta B'Chazara, but a Kayin Gadol who he can't go free when the Kohen Gadol dies. He is the Kohen Gadol. So he'll never be able to achieve freedom through this method. So you might think that Golus does not apply to him. Legally, we would have thought that he wouldn't go into Golus. So before I turn over the daf, I just want to get clarity. The Chiddush is, it must be the Chiddush is that a Kohen Gadol has to submit to the justice system, because I would have had a havamina that not, because when he kills B'Shoigig, there's a spur to say that he shouldn't have to comply and go into Golos, Kamash Malon, that he does. So the Tanan we learned, turning on to the next half.
So how does he get away from the Gael Adam?
I'm not sure how that would work. I'm not sure. I wonder if the Gemara talks about that.
Yeah.
Because we use Golos for two purposes. We use it for a quasi oynish, but it's also used to protect him from the Goyal Adam. Without going to Golos, how does he have that protection? I'm not sure. Hahoyer Kohen Gadol, oy Kohen Gadol shahara. If someone kills the Kohen Gadol, or the Kohen Gadol was killed, as a nefesh, eino yoytzim misham lo'olam, he goes into Golos and he never gets out. That was only Havmin. Lamai said the Kohen Gadol does go into Golos, does go into Ari Miklat, and he gets that protection. You're asking, according to the Havamina, that he does not go into Golos, how would he had that protection? But the Maskana, anyway, he does have it. He never goes out of Golos. So therefore, maybe you might suggest that a Kohen Gadol shouldn't have to go into Golos at all. Kamash Malan, that he goes into Golos. How do you know that he goes into Golos? You're bringing up a good point. He can't have the Chazara, so maybe he shouldn't go into Golos. He's included. So why is it that if someone kills a Kohen Gadol, he doesn't go free? But the next Kohen Gadol, when he dies, should set him free. So Rashi addresses this. A higher Kohen Gadol, B'Shogig. Someone killed a Kohen Gadol B'Shogig. Goyla le'ir miklat. He goes to the ir miklat. You never get out. Why? The chivan the ein Kohen Gadol b'mikdash. Kishu Goyla, since there is no Kohen Gadol in the Beis Hamikdash, when he goes into Golos, the misas miyashuv. The halacha is the Kohen Gadol who is in power. When this person went into Golos, when that specific Kohen Gadol dies, then he goes free. But if there is no Kohen Gadol at the time that he ran into Golos, because he killed that Kohen Gadol, then there is no one to release it. Or if the Kohen Gadol goes into Golos because he killed the Shagig, then Mises mi Yashuv, like a Kohen Gadol. There's no Kohen Gadol at the time. Tosha speaks out, but if they appoint another Kohen Gadol right away before he goes into Golos, so then he does have a Kohen Gadol that can release him. If we look at the top Toshas, Pirish Uchagoyin Shaloi Minu Acher Ad Shenigmar Dinai. It's only relevant if there was no Kohen Gadol in place when the Gemara didn't happen that sent him to Golos. Uchagoyin, you also have to say the Leka Meshuach Sha'ovar. There was not a Meshuach Muhammad. There wasn't a spare Kohen Gadol, because a spare Kohen Gadol's death would also be Machzer. Okay, Zok to Gemara Vater. Over alasei v'aloiseseh. A Kohen Gadol is over on an asei v'aloiseseh. Frank Gemara, loy sogi, the loy over. Well, just by definition, just because somebody is a Kohen Gadol, he's automatically over and say in the loisasa. Zok to Gemara. Hachikamar. Im over Allah say the loisasa if a kohen gadol was over on an say, or if he was over in a loisasa, harehu chehedit l'chol dvarav. We treat him like a kohen hedget, meaning he'll get malchus. Whatever the has to be done with someone who's over in the same loisasa gets done to a kohen gadol as well. Pshita, Perek Gemara, what's the chiddush? So kedai techamina, I would have thought, hoil v'tznan, since we learned, ain't done in loyas hashevet, v'loyas novi hasheker, v'loyas kohen gadol, ela al pi bezdin shel shivim ve'echad. Our Mishnah taught us, the first Mishnah taught us, that a kohen gadol, when he goes to din Torah, it's always a bezdin of 71. The Omer of Adabar Abba, and Rav Adabar Abba taught us on our first Mishnah. Kol hadavar hagadol yoviyu elecha means davar shel gadol. It means anything of a gadol, any VIP who has to be in bezdin goes to a bezdin of 71. Ema kol davar shel gadol. You might think that when Rav Adabar Abba said anything of a gadol, it means any trivial matter that's related to a VIP automatically goes to 71. Even a question of a lav and malchus, even a question of the nemominus. Kamash malon, that only a chiv misa of the kohen gadol goes to the bezdin gadol, but other things don't go to the kohen, don't go to the 71. So only if a kohen gadol is up on a charge of chiv misa, there he goes to a bezdin of 71, but not all other things. The ema hachanami. Maybe even every little trivial matter that a kohen has to adjudicate should go to a bezdin of 71. So tomorrow, miksiv divrei gadol, it says hadavar hagadol ksiv. We're darshaning, it means of a VIP, but the pasuk's words is for a big thing, davar gadol mamish. So therefore, it's only for a chiv misa that we would take a kohen gadol to a bezdin of 71, unlike a regular person who would have a bezdin of 23. But for trivial matters, smaller matters, would go to a regular bezdin. Meid u'meid anoisa. A kohen gadol could say edus, and you could say edus for a kohen gadol. Meid. Where do we know that a kohen gadol says edus? If anything, we shouldn't let a kohen gadol say edus because it's not respectful for him. But Tanya, we learned v'salamta. Even when you find an aveda, there are certain times where the Torah says you should overlook the aveda and you shouldn't be busy with it. There are times where you could overlook the Aveda, and there are times where you shouldn't. What if the person who finds Aveda is a Kohen, but he sees at a distance that the Aveda is located in the basic forest? So in order for the Kohen to be Isaac in the Aveda, he's going to have to be Mitam himself, which he's not allowed to do. Or Zakein, let's say the Aveda is some animal on the floor, and this fellow is an older, prestigious Rav who he doesn't gribble with animals. Or what if whatever he would salvage in the Aveda is worth $1,000, but if this person engaged in his normal trade in that same period of time, he'll earn way more than that. So there again, he doesn't have to. L'kach nemar, that's why the puzzle tells us v'salamto, because sometimes you are allowed to overlook an aveda. So too, over here, it's not covered for a kohen gadol to come and say edus. Maybe there should be a svara. Maybe there should be a svara that a kohen gadol should not come and say edus. Zok to Gemara, Amr Yosef, you're right. For a normal person, it's Eina Levichvoidoi, a kohen gadol shouldn't come and say testimony in court. But here the question is made lemelach. If it was the melech that was on trial, there he's allowed to come and say edus. Frankly, Gemara, how could the melech be on trial? But none we learned loy done v'loy done an oisai, loy made v'loy meid an oisai. A melech would never need edus. So why? How can you tell me that when the Mishnah says the kohen gadol says edus, he's saying it on behalf of the melech? El Omar Bzeira made Leven Melech. We're speaking about if the person who needed the edus was the son of the king, there kohen gadol was not allowed to come. Frank the Gemara looks at it, it's black and white. Vaha. Ben Melech Hedjitu. The Ben Melech is a regular Hedjit. So surely the Kohen Gadol should not have to say Edus on behalf of the Ben Melech. Elo zok the Gemara, Meid b'fnei HaMelech. He will say Edus in front of the king, and the king will act as Dayan. Frank the Gemara, how could the king act as a Dayan? Va'ein Moshivin Melech b'Sanhedrin. You don't put a Melech on the Sanhedrin. Zok the Gemara, Mishum Yakri the Kohen Gadol. What happened if his son was on trial and we needed the Kohen Gadol to say testimony? We would put, out of respect for the Kohen Gadol, we would put the king in the Bezdin, and he would sit there during the Kabbalah Seidus. El Mishum Yakri the Kohen Gadol, also the Yosef, he would sit there, Mekabel in the Helelas Haduse. He would be there to receive the Edus of the Kohen Gadol. So the Baal Melech is there receiving the Edus of the Kohen Gadol. There it is respectful for a Kohen Gadol to come and say Edus. After the Edus is accepted, then Koyhu, the king gets up, Va'azul, and he leaves, because we know a king doesn't sit in the Sanhedrin. So he's only there while they're receiving the testimony of the Eid, the Kohen Gadol. Uminyan Yodoloi Anan Bidinei, and the rest of the Sanhedrin continue on with the Psak Halacha. So at the end of the day, when the Mishnah says that a Kohen Gadol says Edus, it's in a very, very unique case. It's when the subject of the Din Torah is the Melech's son, and there the Kohen Gadol will come to say Edus if the Melech is sitting there in the Bezdin while the Kohen Gadol is saying his testimony. A very unique situation. But normally it's Enel of Ichvoidoi, and the Kohen Gadol would not say Edus. Gufa Zokta.
And Tim, did you say the son is the subject of the Din Torah?
Yes.
So how can he give Edus? He's a Negebedover.
The Melech is receiving Edus.
The Melech is receiving Edus on
the Kohen Gadol, and the Kohen Gadol is not a Negebedover to the son of the Melech.
So what's the Melech doing exactly?
We would not allow the Kohen Gadol to say Edus in Bezdin, because it's not l'chichvoidoi for a Kohen Gadol to come testify in Bezdin. But if the Melech is sitting there, so now it is l'chichvoidoi. So we bring the Melech there just while the Kohen Gadol is saying his testimony, because since the Melech is there, then it is respectful for a Kohen Gadol to say Edus in front of the Melech. In front of a regular Bezdin, it's not respectful. But in front of the Melech, it is respectful. And the Melech then has to get up and leave because he can't paskin on any case, in the case of his own son. Okay. Zok Margufa. Ein Moshivin Melech b'Sanhedrin. A Melech should not be a member of the Sanhedrin. V'loi Melech the Kohen Gadol the Iber Shana. And the Melech and the Kohen Gadol may not be involved when they're discussing making an Iber Yard, because they're both Nogei B'Dov. Melech b'Sanhedrin. Why can't a Melech be on the Sanhedrin? Dechsev loisana al Riv, and we darshan loisana al Rav, meaning you shouldn't be arguing on somebody greater than you. We know that the minhag is that the greatest member of the Bezdin would always speak last, because nobody would dare argue on his opinion. Problem is, you're not allowed to argue on the king's opinion, or you're not allowed to argue on the king's opinion. So therefore, if the king would have an opinion, everybody would have to agree to it. That's not exactly going after Rav, which is required in a Bezdin. So that's why a king cannot be a dayan. And loy melech v'chayin gadol be'iber shana, because when they gave it over, melech mishum afsanya. The melech used to pay his employees twice a year, before Sukkot and before Pesach. So if he's sitting on the Bezdin to discuss if there should be an extra month, it's in his best interests, of course, to add an extra month, because that defers the payment that he needs to make to his employees. So he's very negei b'davar. He's biased on the tzad of adding the extra month, and therefore he can't be on such a Bezdin. Kohen Gadol, on the other hand, Kohen Gadol does not want to add the extra month. Mishum tzina. If he adds an extra ador, that means it's going to push Yom Kippur off into September or even October. And what's going to happen is it's going to be cold on Yom Kippur. What does a Kohen do on Yom Kippur? He's constantly toiveling and walking around barefoot in the Beis Hamikdash. That's very not comfortable to do during cold weather. So therefore, he has an interest in not making an Ibiyar because he would want Yom Kippur to fall out as early as possible. So since they're both Nageh B'Davar, they wouldn't be allowed to paskin on the discussion of making an Ibiyar. Omar Rav Papa said, Shema Bino, we see from here that Shata Basa Yarcha Azu. This is an interesting comment. Rashi says, what does it mean Shata Basa Yarcha Azu? Achar Yerachim Haruyim Liyos Imaloinis Abra Hailech Kar V'Chaim Shel Shana. The temperature, the climate is dependent upon what lunar month it is. Achar Yerachim Haruyim Liyos Imaloinis Abra Hailech Kar V'Chaim Shel Shana V'Tzina Haruya B'Mach. So V'Tzina Haruya B'Macheshvan Have B'Tishrei Kim Misaberes. And the cold that should really be in Cheshvan will end up being in Tishrei if we add an extra month to the calendar. And that was the reason why the Kohen Gadol wouldn't want to add an extra month. Frag to Gemara, how could you say that? V'hahanach gimel roi bakar. There were these three shepherds that have a kaimu that they were talking, and the Rabbanan overheard their discussion. The Shamina Rabbanan, one of the shepherds said the following: Im bechir v'lokish kechada yinots dein hu adar, v'imlav less dein adar. If the wheat that was planted later, together with the wheat that was planted earlier, if they're both going to sprout at the same time, then I consider this month adar. But if not, then it's not yet the end of the winter. It's still considered Shvat because the crops aren't ripened yet or aren't units. I think means this, it's not sprouted yet. Less than other. Let's see Rashi. Rashi says, "In bechir v'lokish kechada yinot dein hu adar in yechaim bekarka." If there'll be some warmth in the ground, the yitzmach zer habechir v'yoafela yachad, the new crops and the older crops grow together. Chitin shenizru v'roish hachoychim v'hasa'orin shenizru achshov. So it seems like the wheat is planted much earlier in the season than the barley. But if they both grow at the same time, that means we're already in the warmer season, and therefore Deinu Adar, we could consider this month to be Adar. But Ve'im Lav, if they're not grown yet, then less Deinu Adar al Shvat, and this has to be Shvat, meaning we have to add a second Adar. That's what one of the Roi Bakr said. The other one said, V'chad Amar, Im Tar B'tzvar B'salag Yomus, U'v'tihara B'tul Ta'ena Yidmuch. If an ox will die of cold in the morning, it'll be so cold for it. And then in the afternoon, when the sun comes up, it's going to be so hot that it's going to seek shelter under a shade. Yishlach Moshe, Dein Hu Adar. Then we consider it warm enough that it's Adar. But Vimlav, less Dein Adar. Then this is not Adar, we're still in the winter. Let's see Rashi. Im Tar B'tzar B'talag Yomus, Im Baboiker Yekar Chazak. If it's so cold in the mornings, Achi Ashar Karav Lomos Machmasina. The shar is almost going to die because it's so cold. But in the afternoon, the V'tihara B'toil Teinasa Yidmoch. Uv'tzarayim in the afternoon, Yigdal Koyach HaChoyim. It will heat up so much. Achi Ashar Meitzal B'tseil Hata'ena. He's going to want to seek shade in the shade of a fig tree. Machmasachayim, because of the heat. V'yishlach Moshe V'yavshid Oirei. He's going to be so itchy from the heat. Yishachek b'te'ena machmasachayim. He'll be scratching up against the tree. So if it's that warm, then we can consider this Adar, but if not, it's considered Shvat, meaning they would have to add an extra month. And the third shepherd said, V'chadamar im kidum takif l'chada yeyafech l'luech nafech l'kiblei deinu Adar. And Rashi says, "Im fartoshes koyach hachorev kolkach." If the winter, the strength of the winter, already weakened, the cold comes from a wind that blows from the east. So if the winter has already died down, then even when the eastern wind blows, you could blow with your mouth and offset that wind. Your breath could overcome the wind from the east. That means it's really died down. And it can heat it up. Then it's Adar it's still cold. Less than Adar el Shvat. It's not Adar, it's only Shvat. And Vavruah Rabbanon Lahishata. And after their comments, the Rabbanon decided to add a Nibiyar. Zok Rashi, V'asu Kishvat. They made that month as if it was Shvat, meaning Shekavu Adar Hasheni Achrov. Bezdin decided that they're going to make a Nibiyar. So what do you see from this story? Al Mashata Basar Ibura Azo. You see that the year isn't totally in the lunar month, it's totally in the Ibor, meaning Nisan Ba'adar, Elaminik Adar Ba'adar Hasheni. So you see that it's not the lunar month that impacts the temperature. To the contrary, they have to adjust around it. Zok to Gemara, V'tizbara, Rabbanon, Arav Sasam, Aru Sasamach. You think that the Rabbanon made their decision based on what the shepherds were saying? Of course, that's not why they made the Ibriyar. El Rabbanon Achush B'nayisam. We already had all of the halachas of when you're going to add a month and when not. They're not doing it because the shepherds are cold. That's definitely not what the main reason for their decision was. They're just saying that our psak, based on other cheshbonis, works out pretty well with the opinion of what the shepherds were saying. Let's see Rashi. Rabbanon achush b'nayusamach even if the temperatures were not supportive of that, they would still make the Iriyar if the other cheshbonis that they have to make. The Tkufa and the Aviv, or people coming from a distance like we had, and they won't make it on time. Is to in this case, it think worked out that the decision that they had to make anyway stemmed well with the comments of the Roy. It worked out well for the shepherds that the independent cheshbon of what the Bezdin made, the Milabed Shana, happened to have coincided with their opinion as well. But maybe by most of the time, the year and the temperatures would follow the month. Boom, that year it didn't. Which is a shtickle chiddush, because I don't understand how the lunar month affects the temperature. But that's what the Gemara is saying, is the lunar month affects the temperature, and what they were commenting is lav dafka. Okay, gewaltig. Let's stop here, and B'ez Hashem on Sunday we will continue with this blot. Chaylos v'chaylos.
Good.
Shkoyach. Modi, thank you very much for setting up the television for the crowd.
How was your drive yesterday?
Baruch Hashem, it worked out very well, and Baruch Hashem, I didn't get stopped by any police. I was I made sure not to speed, and
what time did you get in?
I got in at 11:30 because I did.